Welcome to tonight's talk, exploration of the life of one of the most controversial popes in history, on the papacy of Pope Pius IX. And it's important to know about his papacy, first because during this series of explorations on modernism, we have to know what underlies what came in the three talks before and will come in the two talks afterwards, the foundations of liberalism. And Pius IX fought it, and he condemned it in no uncertain terms in his encyclical that we'll be looking at midway through, the Syllabus of Errors, which was enclosed in the cyclical Quanta Cora. Our faith is being attacked, as we know, and Satan uses different methods. Most of those methods have the underlying foundation of liberalism. And so if we know the errors that will be presented tonight, then it'll be easier to identify them and hopefully save ourselves and others. Pius IX had the longest papacy in history, second only to St. Peter himself, just 4 months short of 32 years. He is the first pope to condemn communism, 1846, and his achievements are still considered milestones in church history. He reestablished the church hierarchy in Protestant countries where it was gone for several centuries. He divined the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854, shown in this picture here. And he renewed condemnation after condemnation against the errors of the day, the philosophy and theology, using philosophy and theology in his encyclicals. And he also summoned the First Vatican Council in 1870. Pius IX will be looking into his life, first what battles he had to face, and then that flows into his condemnation in his Syllabus of Errors. And then the second half will be on the foundation of those errors, the sort of history, the foundation of liberalism, and then we'll end with, perhaps, unfortunately, the shortest part, which is the solution, what we can do about these errors. But you should be able to identify what we should be able to do by just thinking the opposite of the things that you do here. He was born on the future feast of Our Lady of Fatima, May 13th, in 1792, Giovanni Maria, Giovanni Battista, Pietro Isidora Maste Ferretti. The Italians like double names. In Senigallia on the Adriatic coast of Italy. His father was a mayor and his mother was a countess, and he was a generous, happy, loving child, fully devoted to Our Lady and the Church, though his years would challenge that for his entire life. 1792 was an ominous year because it was the year of, 3 years into the French Revolution. It was the same year, so he was born just a few months before the September massacres, where in just a few days, 1,400 people, mostly religious, were slaughtered in the streets of Paris. Less than a year later, the King of France, Louis XVI, would be guillotined, and a little over a year later, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, would be guillotined. France was being punished, and because France was being punished, all of Europe would be punished by their problems. France was being punished for killing Pope Boniface VIII, on the top left picture. They are responsible for keeping the Pope captive for 72 years, which we'll get into a little bit later. Gallicanism in France said that the church in France was independent of the church in Rome, a serious problem in France which spread throughout the world. In the bottom two pictures on the left, Cardinal Richelieu on the left hired, during the 30 Years' War in 1618 to 1648, he hired a military expert, a Protestant from Sweden, who defeated the Catholic Emperor Ferdinand and forever severed Christendom, thanks to a Catholic cardinal. The lives and courts of both Kings Louis XIV and Louis XV were scandalous and known to be scandalous worldwide. And what we'll be talking about later is in the Age of Enlightenment, France spread a mockery of God throughout the world, so they were being punished. The driving force behind the French Revolution, and the number one enemy for Pope Pius IX throughout his life would be Freemasonry. It was a scourge that came to Europe from England in 1717. It used to be a guild of Masons, working Masons, but it was Protestantized a long time ago in England and then spread from there. It became a philosophical, pseudo-religious society. Its formulas, ceremonies, traditions all seemed rooted in Eastern religions and Judaism. As the historian William Thomas Walsh says, the degrees and rituals of Freemasonry are shot through with Jewish symbolism. The candidate is going to the east, towards Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, destroyed in fulfillment of Christ's prophecy. The official coat of arms of the English Grand Lodge, even to this day, is the one made in 1675 by Rabbi Jacob Leon, known as Templo. The constitutions and rituals were drawn up by the Scotch Presbyterian minister, James Anderson, and the Huguenot refugee minister, John de Segulier. The first Grand Master of Freemasonry in 1722 was the Duke of Wharton, known throughout the world as one of the most immoral men in the world. This new Freemasonry in 1625 spread to Paris and then throughout the rest of Europe. One of the leading philosophers of Freemasonry in France was Voltaire, François-Marie Arouet, known as by the pen name of Voltaire. He returned to France after receiving it from England and spread it everywhere. He had a consuming hatred for Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church, and he said, "The Christian religion is an infamous religion. It must be destroyed by 100 invisible hands. It is necessary that the philosophers should course through the streets to destroy it, as missionaries course over earth and sea to propagate it. They ought to dare all things, risk all things, even to be burned in order to destroy it. Let us crush this wretch." Freemasonry would spread throughout the world the revolt against the Pope and the authority of the state. But this developed into a more sinister form of Freemasonry when Adam Weishaupt in the late 1700s developed Illuminized Freemasonry, what we know today as the Illuminati. He was a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria and gave Masonry the form that we know today. His method is still used today. They invite people in through the lower ranks, barely shaking their faith, but just giving slight doubts as they enter the very low ranks. They don't attack Christianity, but they merely swear to God in all their oaths, carefully, though, calling him the architect and not the creator. They avoid all mention of Christ and any mysteries of the faith, and say they respect all faiths and all convictions. Those who meet the necessary requirements, have no moral sensibilities, are irreligious, immoral, can learn the espionage and the secrets of the occult that Freemasonry has. As we know, the visible leaders are never known. There's a secret ring, and then above that, there's one leader with 6 advisors who's known to very, very few throughout the world. On July 16th, 1782, Adam Weishaupt gathered all Masonic bodies throughout the world in the Congress of Wilhelmsbad, and there were 3 million members, which was in this year 65 years after the founding of this revised Freemasonry. And that's when he allied Illuminism and Freemasonry, which had an incredible depth for evil throughout the world. Rome, in July of 1865, said that judging by its actions and its zeal for evil, the supreme architect whom they call upon is none other than Satan, who directs and inspires their leaders. At this Congress, Masonry became one organized atheistic mass. All irreligious groups were organized into Illuminized Freemasonry, and their goal was to abolish monarchy, organized government, private property, marriage, immorality, and require the government education of children. At this Congress, Jews were emancipated from their stigma, and the Jewish influence became soon one of the driving forces of Freemasonry. The headquarters of Illuminized Freemasonry was Frankfurt, which was the headquarters of Jewish banking in Europe, home of the Rothschilds. Here, plans for world revolution were perfected. Schemes were enacted with diabolical certainty. France was first, Italy was second. The French Revolution, we know what happened there. They caused revolutions all throughout Europe in the significant years of 1830, 1848, and 1870. They attacked Italy, seized the Papal States, and plotted to destroy the papacy. They achieved their scheduled revolution in 1917 in Russia, and they brought about the downfall of Europe through their revolutions of World War I and World War II. The fact that they were behind the French Revolution is openly known and boasted of by the Freemasons. The leaders of the French Revolution, as Pius IX started his life, were Voltaire, Rousseau, Lafayette, and Talleyrand, who were all Masons. The members of the Jacobin Club in Paris were all Freemasons. They brought down the king. The leaders of the Reign of Terror, Danton, Marat, and Robespierre, were all Masons. Philip, Duke of Orleans, who was the cousin of Louis XVI, and who was the one who cast the deciding vote to kill his cousin, would later become the first Grand Master of the Grand Orient Lodge of France. The revolution's purpose was not to help France. It was to destroy the monarchy and overthrow the Christian society at which they were very successful. While this is going on in the background during Pius IX's life, Pius IX experienced tumultuous upheavals in Italy during his lifetime and then later during his papacy. In 1798, Napoleon sent his troops into Italy, and they took the 80-year-old Pius VI, dragged him from his palace, as shown on the bottom right, and imprisoned him. They brought him back to Valence, France, where he died of the mistreatment a month later. Pius VII would lose the Papal States temporarily. Those were the original Papal States, started under Charlemagne, Pepin, and then they would eventually lose all of them later on. Pius VII, though, was Pope from 1800 to 1823, and he was kind of like a father figure to Giovanni, Pius IX. Giovanni knew Pius VII personally, and when the future Pius IX asked to become a priest at the age of 27, he couldn't because of his epilepsy, which he had for the past 10 years. And Pius VII said, "You may become a priest because that epilepsy will never afflict you again." And it never did. As Pius IX went on to become a priest in Rome, counselor to apostolic delegate in Chile, domestic prelate, Archbishop of Spoleto, the Bishop of Imola, and Cardinal Archbishop, he was never attacked by his epilepsy. Pius IX, before and during his papacy, had to deal with the age of liberalism. The politics behind liberalism will be the second half, but for now it is enough to know that liberalism focuses on the freedom of the individual. Freemasonry says this allows people to do whatever they want, but we know as Catholics that true liberty is the freedom from the restraint in doing what we ought to do. Religious liberalism has three forms. Absolute religious liberalism is complete subordination of the church to the state. Moderate religious liberalism is the separation of church and state. And Catholic liberalism, which is what Pius IX condemned many times, especially in his first encyclical, is one religion is as good as another, and all can get to heaven by following any religion they choose. We'll get more on that later. Pius IX was actually considered a liberal because of his political views when he became elected pope on June 16, 1846, at 55 years old. The liberal world rejoiced, actually, and the Catholic world groaned because they didn't think that he would fight the liberal satanic hordes that were rampaging all across Europe. This is 2 years before the Great Revolution in Europe at 1848. These hordes of liberals were massed behind deceptive promises like progress, democracy, liberty, equality, and fraternity. They were tearing apart Catholic kingdoms, abolishing monasteries, closing convents, and legislating for government education of children. He showed his liberal tendencies by, after his election to the papacy, Pius IX ordered the Jews to be let out of their ghettos and emptied the jails of thousands of political prisoners to be let loose on the city. These prisoners started milling around his palace that evening, the Quirinal Palace, saying, "Long live Pius IX, Pio Nono." He instituted many constitutional reforms which encouraged Protestants and liberals worldwide. England praised him, the source of Freemasonry, and he became the most popular man in the world. Pius IX would soon show that his liberalism was political, not religious. In December of 1847, 1 year later, he issued Ubi Primam, where he said, "The people think that I'm on their side, and they think I will feel kindly towards any person who thinks that you can achieve salvation by following any religion. Let therefore those who wish to be saved, though, come to the pillar and ground of truth. This church has grown in the midst of many difficulties, is renowned throughout the world because of its miracles, is enlarged by the blood of its martyrs, ennobled by confessors and virgins, and strengthened by the writings of the fathers." In the year of Revolution, 1848, thrones were toppled, many Catholic rulers and government officials were forced to flee, and orders had been sent out by the supreme head of Illuminized Freemasonry, the highly respected and the unsuspected British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston. He gave the Italian Prime Minister money to take over the Papal States, and he set up the short Victor Emmanuel in place of Pope King Pius IX. In January of 1848, a revolt broke out in Sicily, which moved all throughout Italy. In February, the Paris Revolution rivaled the French Revolution of 1789. The revolution in the very Catholic city of Vienna happened in March, and in April, the Pope became a prisoner in his palace because he and the cardinals would not go along with the Italian people's wish to attack Austria and unite Italy. Pio Nono saw Illuminized Freemasonry, saw the liberal movement for what it was, and he would, from that moment on, as a prisoner in his palace, in April of 1848, never be the same for the rest of his life, the remaining 30 years. He published a speech in April which said he wouldn't declare war on Austria, and from that moment on, he became the most unpopular man in Italy and then throughout the world. Meanwhile, in September, northern governments were hiring assassins to slaughter government officials in the streets. Men were hunted down, and bodies were left to rot unburied. In November, Pius IX's prime minister, on his way to Parliament, was stabbed in the neck because he was a strong defender of the Papal States. Then there was now a mob in Rome. Pius IX was now completely surrounded and surrounded by the power of the revolution going on. One by one, his government officials deserted him, and his own cavalry and troops went over to the side of the mob in Rome, over to the revolution, opened the jails, and released frenzied, vicious criminals willing to kill for money. Only the diplomatic corps remained faithful to Pius IX, though Great Britain and the United States were not there. A mob was milling dangerously in front of his palace on November 16th, and that is when the Republican deputies burst into the Pope's room, followed by 20,000 of his own troops, Pope's own troops. They wanted the Pope to agree to their demands to follow the Italian anti-Christian regime and give over the Papal States. He was only defended by 100 Swiss guards, 2 cardinals, and a few priests and servants. That is when a reign of terror broke out in Rome. Drums beat from every section of the city. Soldiers came towards the Quirinal Palace from every section, and they scaled the palace with ladders, and the mob set fire to it twice. Bullets were shot at all windows, and the Swiss guard tried to fire back. At 8 p.m., the soldiers brought 2 pieces of field artillery and focused them on the gates leading to the Quirinal Palace. And they sent an ultimatum to the Pope saying, If he didn't consent, they would break in and slaughter everyone in the palace except for him. The Pope then told the ambassadors he must yield so as to avoid a slaughter, and he was left in the care of his murderous civic guard. Now, perhaps the only positive thing in this talk that France ever did was on November 24th, the French ambassador came to the Quirinal Palace and demanded an audience with the Pope and said he had urgent business with him. So he goes in and starts shouting and reading to the Pope. And then a little while later, as some of us know, a parish priest and Pius IX's servant walked out of the room and went down a hallway, out a corridor, into the courtyard, and there was a carriage waiting for them. They drove past spies and sentries through less frequented streets and met the Count of Bavaria and his attendant, both fully armed, and in this way, Pius IX and his attendant fled. Pius IX was driven at high speed to the kingdom of Naples, where he lived for 2 years in freedom. Back in Rome, the French ambassador kept reading for a couple hours and then told the soldiers outside the door that the Pope was not to be disturbed. He was retiring for the night. So only in the morning did Rome, infuriated, realize that the Pope was no longer in their control. When he returned in April of 1850, every trace of liberalism had vanished. He condemned liberalism in so many speeches and denouncements in uncompromising words. And in 1854, on December 8th, is when he defined ex cathedra the dogma of Mary's Immaculate Conception. On December 8th of 1864, on the 10-year anniversary of this dogmatic proclamation, is when he proclaimed his Quanta Cora and Syllabus of Errors, which rocked the world and raised a storm of hatred against him. The syllabus is merely a compilation of most of his other writings, his condemnations. And these errors that are condemned in the Syllabus of Errors were damaging the foundations of the faith all across the Christian world, bringing down governments and morality, ushering in the reign of Antichrist under the guise of modern progress, modern science, modern social institutions, liberty, and liberalism, enlightenment, and civilization. In the Syllabus of Errors, in the Quanta Cora, he covers 6 main points. He condemned the principle that society should be made and governed as if religion didn't exist. He condemned the principle of freedom of conscience and freedom of worship, strange to us Americans. He said, but while they rashly affirm this idea, these evil men do not think and consider that they are preaching liberty of perdition, and that if human arguments are always allowed free room for discussion, there will never be wanting men who will dare to resist truth and to trust in the flowing speech of human wisdom, whereas we know from the very teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ how carefully Christian faith and wisdom should avoid this most injurious babbling. He condemned the principle that people are sovereign above all human and divine rights. The other 3 are affirmations, other 3 points. He affirmed the absolute independence of the church against any civil authority. He also affirmed the church's right to train consciences, especially the youth. And he said that it is an error of communism and fate and socialism to think that it's the state's job to educate children and to think that parents have the right to educate and raise a family from the civil authorities. He said, for all who have endeavored to throw into confusion things both sacred and secular, and to subvert the right order of society and to abolish all human rights, they have always devoted their nefarious schemes, devices, and efforts to depraving incautious youth and have placed all their hopes in the corruption of youth. In the following syllabus, he points out 80 condemnations, you can read on your own, but that condemn these principal points, the errors of the day. And I'll just read you a few from the Syllabus of Errors, a few that we can take to heart as condemnations. Human reason, without any interference, without any reference whatsoever to God, is the sole arbiter of truth that is condemned. It is law to itself, and reason suffices by natural force to secure the welfare of men and nations. It is an error to think that the faith of Christ is in opposition to human reason, and divine revelation not only is not useful, but hurtful to the perfection of man. He says it is condemned to think that every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. He condemns the idea that good hope at least is to be entertained to the eternal salvation of all those who are not in the true church of Christ. This unfortunately may sound familiar. He condemns the idea that Protestantism is nothing more than another form of the same true Christian religion, in which form it is given to please God equally as the Catholic Church. He condemns the idea that ecclesiastical power ought not to exercise its authority without the permission of the civil government. He also condemns the idea that civil government, even when in the hands of an infidel sovereign, has a right to the negative power over religious affairs in a country. And the list continues on and on. That was point number 41. So there are plenty, but it is worthwhile reading, and many of them are applicable to what we're seeing today in modern society. But these errors were destroying the faith all over the world under Pius IX. In the following years, he condemned Freemasonry 6 times, from 1846 to 1873. He said, "You are from your father the devil, and it is the works of your father that you wish to do." He convoked an ecumenical council in 1868, which made the church's enemies furious. This was Vatican Council, we call it today Vatican I. This first Vatican Council, which defined dogmatically the infallibility of the Pope. And as soon as he finished his proclamation, a thunderstorm broke out as the voting began. So it was a very momentous time for the church in more ways than one. The same day he defined the infallibility of the Pope, war broke out between France and Prussia. So that's the First Vatican Council. And then when the war broke out, Napoleon III of France took his French troops from Rome. And so Victor Emmanuel took advantage of this, took over Rome, on September 20th, 1870, the day that the Papal States no longer belonged to the Pope. And ever since then, the Pope has been confined to Vatican City. They passed anti-Catholic laws legislating all sorts of things that we've just condemned in the syllabus of errors. And Pius IX remained, for the last 7 years of his life, a prisoner in the Vatican. He would not step outside the Vatican. He lived his simple life, living in one of the smallest rooms of the 11,000 rooms at his command. He provided for the poor and spent hours in prayer and meditation. He died on February 7th, 1878, at 86 years old, mourned by the true Catholic Church all over the world, hated to the end by his church's enemies, as shown by the fact that 3 years later, when they moved his body from the Vatican to St. Lawrence, it had to be done at night because a mob was planning to take his body out of the coffin and desecrate it on the way over. His last words were, he told the cardinals to guard the church he loved so well and sacredly. Now, to give you a bit of a background to what he was fighting, I want to give you a few of the main ideas of liberalism. But from a historical perspective, it's interesting to think, how did we go from such a peak of flourishing church art and architecture in the High Middle Ages to the downfall century by century of Christendom, which we cannot return to as of now. Liberalism is a political and social philosophy that emphasizes the freedom of the individual to follow their own desires in their social, religious, and economic life. And this came from several factors. After the High Middle Ages, we saw a flourishing in architecture that has not been surpassed. It is a flourishing of originality and novelty, which was the key facet of the High Middle Ages: originality and novelty. The church used all the arts for the worship of God. The architecture was beautiful, the stained glass windows and the light and the structure preaching sermons that surpassed human words. The church would then go on to found universities. That is the backdrop of the church, the cathedral at Seville. They went on to found universities, one of the greatest contributions made to the Western world, and the legacy has lasted to this day. They came up with scholasticism, a question and answer form of learning, the greatest example of which is St. Thomas Aquinas, considered by many sources to be one of the greatest minds in the history of the world. He transformed Western theology and philosophy and law. Two of the greatest religious orders were founded, the Dominicans and Franciscans, who revolutionized Europe and the world by their ascetical and academic life. So what happened? There was so many good things going on there, and then Pope Pius IX just got thrown out of his papal palace in Rome. But this was several hundred years later. But there were some key elements that I want to point out that led to this year of revolution in 1848. There was, because of all the prosperity in the Middle Ages, people were becoming so attached to money that they began to grow cold, which is why it was during the High Middle Ages that the Pope said you have to go to communion at least once a year. It was during the peak of the church's history. So it was because of this coldness. And if you read the collect for Corpus Christi, you'll see that, the collect for St. Francis of Assisi, it mentions that coldness there. So St. Francis of Assisi found his order to combat that coldness towards God. And there was an agricultural revolution which added to this prosperity. It's interesting to note that from the year 1000 to the year 1300, it was the greatest weather for agriculture in the history in recorded history. But this money-making coldness then led Europe to be punished later on because of their indifference towards God. So Europe would then suffer famine in the 1300s, the Black Death, 100 Years' War, and so on in the 1300s. There was an idea that kind of broke the High Middle Ages from what came afterwards, and this was nominalism. William of Ockham, he was a priest, he overthrew that trust between faith and reason. And with this weird idea, he didn't think it was weird, but that the human mind can only know individual things. So when you look at a group of people, you can say, oh, okay, we see these similar characteristics, and all people have them, so that must be a human characteristic. Well, his idea was, and it sounds weird, but it was significant, his idea was, no, what you experience is your own experience. You can look at different human things, but that doesn't apply to anything else. It's just that particular instance, that's what you experience. But this led to the idea that reality is what you perceive with your senses. It's not from the intellect. So it led to a distrust of the intellect that St. Thomas Aquinas had given such power to. And it led to the idea that two things can be different but true. So faith and science can both be true, but both be opposed to each other. And so this was the start of the foundational shift in thought from the Middle Ages. Then the Renaissance, because it focused on the man, it rejected the Middle Ages because they're the ones who termed the Middle Ages. They said it was just a midpoint between ancient Greek and Roman civilization and the high point of world history known as the Renaissance. They were interested in that ancient culture, and so they emphasized empowering man, doing anything to make him a well-balanced, cultured, earthly person. So the philosophy of humanism tended to focus more on how can we improve ourselves in this world instead of serving God. Another break from the Catholicism of the High Middle Ages. So humanists didn't start out atheistic, but basically led everyone to ignore God. There was a decline in respect for the papacy because the popes were in France for 72 years. The king of France was very powerful, so to please him, King Philip IV, King Philip the Fair. To please him, they said, well, we'll elect a French cardinal as pope, and this was Clement V. And to please the king even more, he went to Avignon to be crowned as pope, and he stayed there. So as he stayed there, he and the next 7 popes stayed in Avignon, and so all the other countries had very little respect for the Pope because he's in France doing what the French king wants. So he's not serving universal interests, he's just serving French interests. And the way the popes acted didn't help either. But that lessened the respect for the popes as well. When Gregory XI, through St. Catherine of Siena's help, got back to Rome, the following election was disputed. The French wanted another Frenchman, even though an Italian was elected. So then they went back and elected their own pope, and now there's 2 popes. For the next 40 years, there's 2 popes. And then for part of that time, there's even 3 popes, because the council said, well, it's kind of confusing. But there were 3 popes, so the countries throughout Europe were deciding, okay, so which pope should we side with? And so it split Europe, and it also led rulers to say, well, our country's interests are more important than the church's interest because we're deciding which pope to follow. And so this led to confusion, lack of respect, and so the papacy's authority, unfortunately, was lessened for the future scourge of Protestantism. There were problems, yes, but not enough to actually overthrow the church. Tomorrow is Halloween, and that's the anniversary of the Protestant revolt. It's 1517. Luther posted his 95 Theses on Wittenberg Cathedral on All Hallows Eve. These theses were distributed all throughout Germany, which made it now a political problem. The Emperor Charles V asked for it to be settled. So it became a political problem, and his actions were followed by other reformers as well. Zwingli in Switzerland, John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. So heretical ideas spread throughout Europe. The Protestant revolt was mostly localized, though, and it only became a world problem when England broke away from the church, and Henry VIII took the whole country with him. Luther's ideas were wonderful for the time. That's the way people thought. Faith alone, we don't have to do good works. That's wonderful. We can hold on to our money now. Scripture alone, now we can decide what's right and wrong. So the ideas caught on and then broke Christendom forever. The unity of Christendom has never returned to the unity it had before the Protestant revolt. Errors were spread everywhere, and private interpretation led many to think that there were several versions of true religion. Eventually, people thought, is there any truth in religion at all? Which was emphasized in also the scientific revolution under Galileo. This also took people away from a unity of faith and a unity of thought in Christendom, leading to liberalism. He was a cocky mathematician who proved Aristotle wrong in his ideas on falling bodies. He made very important discoveries in mechanics and physics, and he improved the telescope. And so he made incredible discoveries in astronomy and led him to believe in heliocentrism. Well, it was just a theory at the time, and he started teaching heliocentrism as fact, that everything revolves around the sun, whereas most people thought that the universe revolved around the earth. And so the church was the leader in science at the time, so they called him aside, and he was Catholic, and said, you have to only say that heliocentrism is a theory, because it contradicts Scripture. Well, not to get into the theology of it, he wrote a book that showed that geocentrism was utterly foolishness, and it made fun of the Pope. So that didn't go over well, so they brought him to Rome for a trial, and he was told to reject heliocentrism, and he had to say the 7 penitential psalms for the rest of his life, and he was put under house arrest, which meant that he went to his rich friend's villa in Naples for a few months, stayed there, and then spent the rest of his life at his villa in his hometown, and he wrote one of his most popular physics books ever. So he was never really imprisoned, but the church has used this trial to say that faith and science cannot coexist. That was brought up during the Enlightenment, especially when Voltaire used these similar arguments to show that the church is against science. Without going too deeply into Newton, because he invented calculus, he invented many things, but his most significant contribution to the world was his 3 laws of motion, because now everybody thought, well, if you describe the world as just a machine governed by laws, then we don't need God. We just have to find the laws of the world, and then we'll be able to discover everything for ourselves. So the science of Newton, with laws explaining everything, combined with the philosophy of René Descartes and doubting everything, led to the religion of deism. Descartes said that humans are material, and the only thing that's free is their soul. So they are governed by laws as well. Everything can be figured out using human reason. So he was Catholic, but his ideas led to skepticism. People started disbelieving divine providence, and he started the Enlightenment. This idea of deism was the combination of Newton and Descartes' efforts, and they said God set the universe in motion and left it alone, like a watchmaker. That's the typical idea of deism. Christ wasn't God. All mysteries of the faith are irrational, so you don't need to believe them. You shouldn't believe them. And Christianity can be just a useful tool for controlling the masses. Enlightened people should stick to science and philosophy. This religion was popular among enlightened intellectuals, since they didn't have to follow anything in particular, and it led many rulers to tolerate all religions, since religion has nothing to do with truth. Now we have a philosophy and a religion to back up liberalism. And this is the last slide. Well, John Locke is the father of liberalism. There's so much more we can go into in liberalism, but for your sake and mine, we'll just go into John Locke, who grew up in England and read Descartes. All Enlightenment philosophers read Descartes, and lived with English political exiles and freethinkers in Holland. He wrote a world-changing book called 2 Treatises on Government, and he said that man originally lived in a state of nature where he was completely free. He has 3 inalienable rights: life, liberty, and not the pursuit of happiness, but property is the third one, property being the most important. So in order to defend those, they gave up some of their freedoms and made a social contract to inform the government. So the purpose of government is to protect a person's individual rights, and that is liberalism. So the most important thing in the world is your own individual rights. A representative assembly is the perfect government to do that, and if a government doesn't do that, just overthrow it and form a new one. His political theory became the basis of most political thinking ever since. Now, these liberal beliefs should be contradicted, and they are contradicted by the Catholic belief that God made us to be in society with each other. And our goal is to help each other be not only good citizens, but good Catholics. And governments are there to help you get to heaven while becoming a good citizen and a good Catholic. So that is the Catholic idea of government. It is not a necessary evil, as liberals think. It is a positive good, and should protect true religion, fight heresy. And so Blessed Pius IX's advice at the end of his encyclical is, take up the word of God, strengthen yourself with grace, and he asked his bishops to protect people from the noxious verbiage of liberalism. Please help the faithful realize that true happiness comes to all from professing and practicing the Catholic faith. And this is an interesting one. He encouraged people to show God's power in their lives, not to show personal freedom. He encouraged people to show God's power through their lives, not personal freedom. For this, we need to pray for God's grace, to pray for God's help, and to use the sacraments to keep ourselves free from sin, because that is when prayer is most powerful. Full of confidence, he says, call on the Immaculate and Holy Virgin, for she slays all heresies and is our affectionate mother. So may the strong faith of Pius IX inspire us to overcome the errors that we see about us today, hopefully not as overpowering as Pius IX experienced, but still pernicious nonetheless in your day-to-day lives. May we show God's power in our lives and not our personal freedom.